Good morning, good day, good
Recording in
evening.
progress.
Good morning, good day, good evening, everybody, wherever you are watching us. I am so delighted. Today is a very special webinar I'm hosting with very distinguished guests. Jeff Manber is, I don't know where to start. We've been working together since 1994. He's now president of International and Space Stations at Voyager Space. He also serves as chairman of the board for Nano-racks, where he was a co-founder and the first employee, and served as the chief executive officer from 2009 till 2021. And he broke barriers for access to space and oversaw the growth of numerous commercial International Space Station programs. The other guest is as incredibly special as the first one, Dr. Andrew Aldrin. He is the president of Aldrin Family Foundation. It's a charitable organization dedicated to harnessing the inspiration of space to ignite a passion for STEM education in students of all ages and backgrounds. He served in leadership roles in this organization since 10 years, during which time he has overseen the extension of educational programs in over 300 elementary schools and universities. Dr. Aldrin is also the program coordinator of Masters of Space Operations at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, and previously had experience in the International Space University located in Strasbourg. Before that, Dr. Aldrin was very active in industry, and today he's combining his knowledge and expertise in talking to us. We are Asgardia, the first in the world history space nation, founded by Dr. Igor Ashurbeli. The purpose, this key scientific mission of Asgardia, is to achieve birth of the first human child in space, and in doing so, to guarantee survival of human species as biological kind in the universe in eternity, when one day the Earth might be unlivable. And today, the trigger for this meeting, actually, that Jeff wrote a book. And this book is about space history, space exploration, all the scientific aspects of it, but also all the cultural encouragement it has triggered. Before we go into looking deeper into the book, I would like my guests to talk a bit more about their personal passion for space. Jeff, after everything you have done, why did you write a book?
Well, it's because of everything I have done. I was really disappointed how little it's understood. First, let me say good day. It's great to see you. I should thank you for giving me the opportunity here. The more I'm in this industry, the more I'm surprised we don't understand the roots. And we have an extraordinary history now. It's now 100 years. 100 years we've been trying to do space travel. And it really began in the 1920s and a little bit before, if you consider some of the dreamers like Tchaikovsky on the Russian side and others. But what really struck me was that few in our industry today understood those first steps. Some of the younger people think exploration began with Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. Some of the older guys like Andy and I know it was with Apollo, okay? But no, it was further back. And more important, and I think maybe we'll get into it, is not only are we 100 years old now, but we began as a commercial venture. We began no different than aviation. And somewhere along the path, the governments took over and have held us back for so long until now. So that's why I wrote the book.
Before we go any further, I can't help making a remark when you speak about those who think that exploration started with Elon Musk. I also know those who think that Leonardo, Donatello, Ninja Turtles. Yeah. While as the story goes, those were the titles of the Italian modules launched via the American shuttle, and it was a contest what to name them. And of course, they were named by Italian public after the Italian artists. But there are also Ninja Turtles like that. And I seriously have been giving lectures to kids who were saying, we know who they are. They were our favorite cartoon. Sorry, I had to say that. Andy, I can't help asking, how did your star father career influence you? He was in the first crew who landed on the moon. That must be huge part of your life.
Well, yeah, it's a big thing, but actually, where I grew up, we have a saying, you couldn't swing a dead cat in one of my classrooms without hitting an astronaut's kid. Astronauts were everywhere. We lived at the end of a street, and it was a cul-de-sac, and so there were 5 houses behind us. 3 of them were astronauts. They were all over the place. So actually having a dad that was an astronaut just wasn't that big a deal. And I'll be honest with you, I had really no desire to become an astronaut. Believe it or not, my passion was the Soviet Union. I became a Sovietologist. And so I've just followed my passion, and I was always interested in space. So an obvious thing to do was I started studying the Soviet space program. And that's actually where Jeff and I ran into each other. We were tromping around Moscow in the 1980s.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it wasn't until I was working at the Rand Corporation, having a great time. I wrote my dissertation on how the Soviet Union beat the United States into space. And that's a topic we'll get into, because I don't know, Jeff is going to love my take on that one. But at any rate, then the Soviet Union went away, which was not good for my career. And so I ended up
for my career, but
I ended up kind of getting invited into aerospace industry because I knew a lot about Russia, and at the time people were very interested in getting involved in Russian space technology. And so here I am, a Sovietologist, and I ended up as an executive at Boeing in charge of advanced programs, strategy, business development, and I was, a Sovietologist. I didn't really have a strong technical, formal background. I'm not an engineer by training. My degrees are in business and political science. So yeah, it's not a normal career path. And it was, I guess the thing about being my father's son is if you know him, he is passionate about one thing and one thing only, and that's space. And he never stops talking about space. And so, and I was the only one around who would listen to him. So, I learned a lot about space and got to hang out with a lot of amazing people in the industry. And so now I actually teach space, and it's truly my passion.
I loved it when he sang, "I'm the Rocket Man" with Snoopy. What's the name of the artist? Snoopy Dogg?
Snoop Dogg, yeah.
Snoop Dogg. I'm not into art, but I was so impressed. Actually, your father was by far more energetic and sincere in that performance. I really loved it.
I wanted to hide under a desk.
But that's part of your job description. You're the son.
No, I mean, think about it anyway.
Okay, so I assume that you were also consulting Jeff and him writing the book, because a lot of it is dedicated to the space program. I am now.
It is. No, Jeff did this. Jeff, I agree with everything in his book, but no, he didn't consult me on it. But it's remarkable for its accessibility and its historical accuracy, and then I think the big point he's trying to make is a really good one.
Okay.
And I think the point where I will reach out to people I know is the later episodes. And so I'm going to go all the way up to our mission to Mars. So it will be in the later episodes that I reach out to people who were there, who understood the Soviets, who understood the breakup of the Soviet Union, the commercialization, so that, we got to get another 40 years or 50 years in the history. So
I would like to mention that in the meantime, in our question section, we just got a greeting from an anonymous user. So greeting back to you, an anonymous user. We are glad to see you. And you can, if you are registered as a participant to this webinar, you can post questions and we will do our best to answer live. And today there is a special opportunity. Since the motivation for this meeting was this book, and I will show you some snippets in a moment. One person from our viewers today, of the registered users, will receive this book as a gift. The media team will be running a randomizer lottery, so it's totally digital dependent. None of us is participating in this selection, but one of you logged in today will receive by post the book. So of course, after you are contacted, you will have to give us your postal address and an agreement that we ship you the book. This day and age, private data is extremely sensitive, so we will have to ask you to tick a few boxes for formalities that we're allowed to send it to you. But it will be personally addressed to you as a result of your today's participation. So without any further ado, I will share the screen and I will show you the cover page of this book. Just give me, yeah, we're there. So I hope everybody can see the cover page. So this is what the book by Jeffrey Manber looks like, From the Earth to Mars. We already have left the Earth. We as humans fly at low Earth orbit, and I assume the title means that sooner or later we will fly to Mars. I would like to take this opportunity to remind that Asgardia sees it the first step of their human mission is settlement in a station in a low Earth orbit, which has artificial gravity, because in order to achieve birth of a first human child, it's necessary to create conditions which are similar to those on Earth, because human body is adapted to gravity. Not necessarily 1G, there is research which demonstrates that there can be different proportion of gravity, but nevertheless, for lengthy life and procreation, it's necessary to have conditions of gravity and conditions of protection from space radiation. We all tend to forget and take for granted that here on Earth, the atmosphere protects us from space radiation. But in the meantime, we are talking about art and about history and about the encouragement which Jeff Manber brings to all of you people interested in space to know the real history. So, Jeff, shall we look further into the book? Can we disclose some of this?
Well, before we do, allow me to just point out who's on the cover. I think that might be interesting. We have 4 of the early pioneers. We have one French person, and the French person, the lowest on the lower right, was a businessman named Robert. I always get wrong. Esnol-Peltier. Everybody called him R.E.P. It wasn't just the hip hop guys go by, abbreviations and acronyms, but he was one of the first space business people. R.E.P. He made his money. I find this so fascinating. He patented the joystick on the early aviation, the early airplanes, and he realized a great deal of money from, and he held a prize that continued into World War II and was a visionary as well. The middle people are very interesting. The gentleman was Fritz von Lying, famous director, German director, silent movies. We still watch Metropolis being one of them. And a movie called, we're going to talk about, The Girl Went to the Moon, was really his suggestion. Theo von Haber, so we'll talk about her. I wanted to really focus on, is the great Russian philosopher Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. And what is so interesting is that in 1890, 1900, 1910, this teacher in a small town in Russia read Jules Verne, the French science fiction writer, who had a movie from the Earth to the Moon. And in that book, 3 people are launched to the moon out of a very powerful cannon that was launched from Florida, by the way. Very strange. 3-person crew out of Florida in, like, I forget, 1860s, during 1860s in the book. And Tsiolkovsky sat down and said, that's not possible from a cannon. Let me try and come up with the math to see. And what he came up with is the Tsiolkovsky equation. And he predicted that we would go to space in three-stage launch vehicles. He did so much. But before we move on, because this is being sponsored by Asgardia, I do want to point out that Tchaikovsky believed in a Russian philosophy called cosmism. And it was about the spirituality of being in space. And it came from an earlier Russian who was his mentor, Fedorov. And it was very important to the Russians in the early days, and I think still important today. It was important to Russian artists, writers like Dostoevsky, who believed that in space we would find our spirituality, that we would really come of age and in fact would achieve, they believed, immortality when we were a space species. And I would imagine, not maybe this conversation, but I imagine there is a link between that belief of the early Russians and Asgardia. So I just want to point that out, that it was interesting, the spiritual foundation of our first steps in rocket travel, and still we see it today.
With this in mind, I would like to ask Andy, with you as a Sovietologist, did you come across, during your studies and during your career, did you come across space history and everything which Jeff just spoke about?
Well, I certainly came across Tsiolkovsky and read some of his work and understood a lot about the early Russian pioneers, Friedrich Sander, and they were very important to the success of Korolev ultimately. I mean, I think what I looked at that was important to me was the creation of a social network of space enthusiasts, and these people were genuine enthusiasts, and they wanted to go into space. They did not really want to build missiles, which missiles were simply a vehicle for them to get to space. In fact, Sputnik, the R-7 rocket that launched Sputnik, was of course, initially a ballistic missile. It was a lousy ballistic missile. And Korolev knew it was a lousy ballistic missile, but it was a great launch vehicle. And as my Russian friends would say, "Ni sluchayno," this is no accident. And because Korolev was building space systems, he simply had to build military systems because it was the only way to get financed. And that's part of what the very fascinating story of Korolev is, as really a bureaucratic entrepreneur.
Bureaucratic entrepreneur, that's a fascinating way of defining it.
Sure. I mean, he was. He did the things that a great entrepreneur does. He took ownership of his programs. He created boundaries between himself and the government. He was brilliant at manipulating the government. There's a couple of famous quotes from him, one of which his military customer, if you will, Marshal Ryabkov, wasn't particular. I would say he wasn't fond of Korolev, because Korolev actually was responsible for an awful lot of promotions that Ryabkov got. But at one point, Korolev is launching the early vehicles. I think it was probably the R1 or the R2, and they were disasters. They would go literally 90 degrees off course. And Ryabkov at one point said, at the time they were fueling the rockets were copies of German rockets, which used alcohol as the propellant, alcohol and liquid oxygen. And so he said, you take 2 tons of alcohol, we put it in your rocket, and you can't even hit a city. You give my troops those 2 tons of alcohol, and I promise you, we will take down any city. And that was the kind of relationship that he had with the military. So the notion that this was a top-down military-driven program, I won't say is ridiculous, but that's just not the way it happened. And Korolev had a tremendous amount of autonomy. And one of the ways that he kept his autonomy is he had a monopoly over information. He knew everything about rockets. Ryabkov and the government knew nothing. And Khrushchev famously said at one point, when I saw the rocket for the first time, we couldn't believe this thing. We thought it was a huge sausage, and we'd go up to it and touch it and lick it. And they did that. And Korolev knew this, and he manipulated the government. It was brilliant. And the trouble is, sooner or later, the government caught on, and they actually created competitors to Korolev. And it was, as Jeff would say, the government ultimately took control of it. But for those first few decades, Korolev ran the show. And that was why the Soviet Union beat the United States into space.
Okay, and then I would like to draw the attention of the audience to the bottom right corner of the cover page. It's episodes 1 and 2, before the governments were involved. So that's exactly what Andy is talking about. I have to admit, I've never heard anything in those terms before. So that in itself is fascinating.
I did see a film clip from Roscosmos just over the past year where they actually talked about Korolev and his independence, and I found that satisfying, let's just say. So somebody in Russia has picked up on that, and I know that there are others certainly of my colleagues that understand the sort of independence that Korolev was able to achieve. But there is still kind of a common narrative out there that the only reason the Soviet Union beat the United States into space was that they had more government support and control. And that just wasn't true.
Andy raises an issue that's really interesting. And you just said, Andy, about how brilliant Korolev was at manipulating the government. One of the themes of this book and the next episodes is how all of the early pioneers were brilliant at manipulating their governments. Mm-hmm. And Korolev was brilliant with only one government. Von Braun was brilliant with both Nazi Germany and the American government. And the Chinese Xian, who became the father of the Chinese program before he was helping the Americans, he was equally brilliant at playing the Chinese and Russian fears against each other when he became involved with the Chinese space program. So one of the themes of the overarching of the episodes is this dance and this bargain among the devils of the leaders of the 20th century politicians. What other effort involved, and I do also love your phrase, Andy, let's talk after this about your trademarking it and my crediting you on bureaucratic entrepreneur, but you have these bureaucratic entrepreneurs who manipulated Hitler, Stalin, Kennedy, Eisenhower, Khrushchev. There was no other undertaking of the 20th century, not internet, not aviation, that had this relationship with the most influential men of the 20th century. And it's good and it's bad.
Yeah, I think part of it is it's a structural thing. And it has to do with, as I mentioned, information and monopolizing information. And early in the development of the technology, it's easier to see that happen. You see some of it in the U.S. nuclear program, where Oppenheimer and Groves did have kind of a monopoly of information, but they were very much aligned with the government, and they knew everyone wanted to build a bomb. And so I think I wouldn't be surprised to find it elsewhere, but I haven't really, looked across the scope of other technological innovations where you do have this kind of tension between space, which isn't necessarily an obvious thing for governments to want to do, and missiles, which were. And so you had different incentives, but von Braun, as we know, wanted to go into space, and he wasn't really all that interested in building missiles. And so I agree with you that von Braun was able to use his monopoly of information. I don't know if space is different, but it certainly looks that way.
There's a great cartoon here in the book that traces von Braun's career backwards from when he's on the shoulders of folks in Huntsville, Alabama, after Apollo 11 landed on the moon, and they're hoisting up this American hero. And I worked with the cartoonist, Jay, And we went backwards in von Braun's career to when he's trying to convince successfully Kennedy, Eisenhower, who ignored him. Then the cartoon goes to him working with Adolf Hitler. And then the cartoon goes further backwards to he's an idealistic student like the ones Andy deals with all the time now, helping out on Germany's first launches with Hermann Oberth and others. So I worked very hard in that cartoon, and it was difficult to go backwards to show the different faces of von Braun.
Before we go into the details, let's have an overview of the book. So Jeff, if you just tell us a few words, what does the book cover in its entirety? Then we can enjoy looking into some more details.
Yeah, thank you. So episode 1 looks at what fascinated me was that in the 1920s, there was this sudden rise of legitimate, tangible interest in realizing the timeless dream of rocket travel. And what was so interesting was not only was it taking place as aviation and humanity was finally flying in the clouds, but it really happened in 2 countries. And it happened in Germany and it happened in Russia. And so I focused, and this wasn't original on my part. There's a lot of historians talk about how the great craze in the 1920s in Germany and Russia. But what is unique, even though it's a graphic novel, there are some original thoughts here. And one of them is breaking down the key ingredients that allowed it to take on this public enthusiasm in Germany and in Russia. And I was so struck how similar it was. Number one, each one had like college dropouts who self-published books, or people who were outside the intelligentsia who had these visions. They sat down, whether Tchaikovsky and Hermann Oberth, Romanian German, sat down and wrote the equation and thought these things all through. Then it involved the media picking it up. Silent films at that time, books became bestsellers. And then in Russia, there was a World's Fair. Who knew? There was a World's Fair in Moscow in 1927 on the heels of one in Ukraine in 1924, devoted to rocket travel. So number one, the book focuses on the 1920s, similarities in Germany and Russia, taking the first steps in realizing that rocket travel would be plausible. I get into a little bit why America was not involved. And then number 2, the other point I really wanted to make clear was before the governments got involved, there was cross communication among them. The Germans are writing to the Russians are writing to Dr. Goddard in America. Dr. Goddard's answering them. There's a World's Fair where the Russians make sure to have everybody's hardware, Brits, Romanians, Germans, Americans. It was emerging as a honest to God commercial marketplace. And so that's the breakdown of episode 1 focuses on the Germans, episode 2 focuses on the Russians, and a little bit as to why the Americans never had the critical mass.
So we expect more episodes to come in the next book, basically.
Yes, I'm writing 3 and 4 now, and I have to tell you, after the optimism of the 20s, 3 and 4 are very depressing. It's the exciting thing, it's the first rockets, but again, on the Russian side, we have the horror of Stalin. We have, as Andy was saying, Korolev working in terrible conditions. I'm writing it now, just finishing episode 3 on what it took to realize the first Russian rockets out of the 2 Russian organizations, GRID, GIRD in English, and GDL in Russian. And you see, Andy, I'm becoming a historian here. It's amazing. And then episode 4 will be the first rocket, of course, the V2, and then it will end episode 4 with the Americans coming in and the Soviets. And so, yeah, I'm working 3 and 4 now.
So
yeah, don't forget there's a critical organization in there. When they brought GERD and GDL together in an institute called RNII, Reactivity Naучный Исследовательский Institute, Rocket Research Institute. And that brought everybody together. And of course, what I think is important, as I mentioned earlier, is in Germany and in Russia, you had these fairly diverse, diffused communities coming together into a critical mass in both places of rocket enthusiasts who shared an ideology. And that's really powerful. And that didn't happen in the United States.
Yeah.
Before we go any further, I would like to comment that I'm fascinated to hear with such strong emphasis that spaceflight from its onset, from when it was pre-thought, it was about peace and cooperation. And Asgardia sets amongst its goals, of course, peaceful use for outer space for the entire humanity. In the meantime, we got a comment, also not a question, from Ariadne Gallardo, who is our Asgardian member of parliament, who is greeting the guests of this webinar. And I would also like to take this opportunity that as one of the features in his career, Jeffrey Manber is also Asgardian member of parliament. And right now we have ongoing elections to the second parliament of Asgardia by the Constitution of Asgardia. The parliament works for 5 years. The first 5-year term is coming to an end. And all of you residents of Asgardia, and those of you who are registered in this webinar are residents, this is your opportunity to apply for parliament. The next opportunity like that will come in 5 years. And of course, all our viewers, you still have a chance to join, to become a resident of Asgardia and to apply for parliament. And Jeffrey already did apply for his second term in parliament. Andy, I will talk to you about this later.
I'm a political scientist. I'm not sure I'm ready to do politics.
Fair enough, fair enough. I'm just fascinated by peacekeeping and by the fact that Asgardia, by its declaration of unity, does not interfere into any earthly affairs. I switched to my favorite page in this book because so many people ask, why countdown? And for the first time, I actually see an answer. Jeff, would you explain?
I am so blown away that it's the first time that for you. And this is what fascinates me about doing this book and doing it in this style. Throughout my career, I've gotten a lot of criticism within our community, especially early on, because of my belief in the importance of the creativity, of the media, of artists. Early on in the NASA program, they did not understand the importance of having non-engineers involved. And I'm getting off on a side subject here. But what fascinated me in doing the research on the silent movie, The Girl to the Moon, by the director Fritz Lang, I discovered that until then, no one had thought, okay, we have a rocket and it's time, let's light the fuse and the launch takes place because they're engineers. And the creative mind of Fritz Lang said, no, it has to be something more dramatic. So in this silent movie, The Girl to the Moon, you see this rocket that looks remarkably like rockets that NASA later developed, including the space shuttle. But this particular rocket is on the launch pad, and the silent movie goes to 10, 9, 8, 7, and it launches. And so the origin of the countdown is a German silent film director.
I didn't know that either. Great
So
story.
the only reason we have a countdown from 10 to 0 is because that's how they could visualize it in a silent movie?
Yeah.
Okay, the world will never be the same again.
Now, there's other good stuff. I'll come up with more stuff.
There's a little bit more to it than that. I mean, there is a very long period of very planned out events that are delineated by time. But I love them because I buy this story, absolutely. It sort of preceded the technology, if you will.
It worked. It had staying power because it was necessary.
Yeah.
I honestly, guys, I'm speechless because I only know the joke, which I don't know if it's a joke, about correlation about the size of the space shuttle and the Romans' horse's ass. But it sounds a bit like that because the carriage driven by a horse was built in relation to the size of the horse. and then it affected the distance between the wheels, and then it affected the distance between the wheels of the train, and then it affected the width between the rails of the rail, and then it affected the size of the tunnels in the United States. And then the shuttle was built by different enterprises which had to be assembled in Florida, and it was transported by railway. So it had to take into account the size of the tunnel where the train fits, which runs on the wheels, which are the same as the distance between the wheels of the chariot of the Roman emperor. And that was built in relation to the size of the Roman horse. So I thought it was a joke, but maybe that's not a joke either.
It certainly applies to a lot of things. The space shuttle is a little different because it actually traveled by boat, at least the big parts of it. The small boosters were transported by rail, so that part's true.
Okay. Well,
We can get into another subject. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Since we're doing joke, I have one which I picked up recently, and I have to share it with all of you. Next time you meet a person who tells you that the Earth is flat, you ask them if it's horizontal or vertical. Sorry, I had to say this. It's too good.
I like it. I honestly haven't come across anybody who said the Earth was flat. I have come across a couple of people who don't believe that you can fly in space.
And that the moon land. And ask your dad how he was featured in the movie about imitating a flight to the moon. Yes, all of you, those who will be watching us on YouTube and on Facebook later, people have landed on the moon.
Some frozen. Is that just me getting the frozen?
It freezes once in a while, but it's the pleasures of living in Zoom.
Okay. Okay.
So those of you watching us now or later who doubt that people have landed on the moon, you are now looking at one of the guests in this show whose father landed on the moon.
Hey, all I can tell you is he went away for 3 weeks.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the best answer is if they faked it, don't you think the Russians would have told somebody?
Or faked it sooner. One other favorite subject I have to pick on, and I have the advantage of doing it being the host of this event, Women in Space program. I found the first woman's picture in the book, so I have to ask Jeff to comment on this.
This is Theo. She was very famous in the 1920s as a writer, and she was the wife of Fritz Lang, the we were just talking about. And you see how history is pretty forgotten today, and Fritz Lang is not. But they worked as a duo, and she would sort of write the book, and then he would make the movie. And he's famous, he's not. She involved in 400, what was called at the time rocket travel, and she wrote a 400-page book that was a bestseller and on rocket travel. And when Herman Oberth wrote a new book, he dedicated it to her first, and then her husband Fritz Lang. But he became the famous one, and because of her book, Fritz Lang and did the silent movie The Girl to the Moon. And what was so interesting about this book is not really get excited in Germany, and it was shown in America and Russia. Not only did it invent the countdown, but there was a stipulation with the movie studio. Now, how cool is this? The movie studio agreed a budget that they would fund the world's first rocket, and Herman Oberth would develop it.
Wow.
So this was all because of her vision. Yeah. Now, I'll get to the end. Guess what? Herman Oberth could not develop a working rocket in time. He left Berlin broke. He left Berlin owing people money. But he, interestingly enough, returned for the premiere of the movie. So I thought to myself that it's not the first time an entrepreneur, working with Hollywood, and the equivalent of Hollywood. So she's very important in the story because a lot of the hardware that they used in their effort to develop this rocket, they went afterwards and saved it And you know what? The Germans did use that for the beginning of their rocket development. So you can trace, I love in this book, you can take her reading, husband doing the movie, the studio paying to develop a rocket. The rocket is full, but the parts were used in the world's first rockets.
Okay. And then we will talk about the impact of the woman in the moon. That I would like to compare notes between Jeff and Andy.
Well, I just discussed that. So there's not okay. We have this. Let me see. Let me find this. But it was fascinating to me how much in the film, and Andy an upcoming book party, and we're going to show the film. I want PC space community to watch this film. You see how much the rocket in the looks like the V2 rocket, the first rocket. How much another rocket looks exactly like NASA space shuttle, and so on. If you can see it, it was a liquid engine. They did trajectory cams on screen that showed the orbital trajectory. And I think in here I also have there was had straps for the crew during weightlessness, and had a commercial.
Okay, for me, Jeffrey is frozen. Andy,
Which is
for you
still alive.
Jeff is frozen. Now he's alive again.
Okay. So it was a commercial mission. They were there to get mining of rare metals, which is still a dream today of rare elements. There was a lot in that film that is still impactful.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
But this is kind of far from reality. That's where the imagination and the vision takes you, right?
Right. Well, this is the 1920s. And when you look, and one of the things on the website, we have a website from the earthtomars.com. And on the website, I list the publicly available in English books that are available. You can read Tchaikovsky in English. You can read, Andy mentioned Frederick Sander. You can read his works in English. And so I want the community to understand we've been thinking about this for a long time. And it may have influenced, and it may, did Elon Musk or did someone suggest Florida because Jules Verne, for example, was suggesting Florida from the Earth to the moon in 1860s. And there's other things I draw on as to how what happened 100 years ago has influenced us to this day.
I think a lot of it is just that there aren't that many ways to do space. And so, technology, space technology for the big things like rockets hasn't really progressed all that much. It's been kind of a refinement. And we're all waiting for something fundamentally different to happen. And we may be, I don't know, we may be waiting for a while. I mean, there are some technologies out there like, is it spin launch? Is that what they're called? That are potentially revolutionary. We've known about space elevators for decades as well. It's, the interesting thing about the history of commercial space is I need to add a wave, but I one of the lectures that I really like doing is I call it the waves of space commercialization. And, this may be the first wave, and it's sort of a submerged wave that happened that nobody even really knew about. And so we had a wave in the 80s with the space shuttle because it was going to revolutionize space travel. And the space shuttle was going to fly for $8 million a mission. We ended up at like $1 billion for mission. So we kind of missed that target, and it was going to populate space with all kinds of really cool things. And there were lots of really cool companies. I don't know, Jeff, did you start a company in that time frame?
No, I was a lousy journalist.
Okay, so then the second wave is at the end of the at the end of the century, so to speak, with the first iteration of satellite constellations, and we were going to darken the skies with constellations, and now we're kind of on the third wave, and there's some similarities in all of these things. The one that concerns me is the first two waves both crashed, or however we got wiped out, particularly in the second wave, by a single event. So there was the Challenger, and then there was the failure of Iridium. And what makes me more optimistic today is I think we have such a strong institutional basis of just not just financial, but technological, sociological, if you will, business foundations that I think we can weather another bad event or a company failing. So I'm more optimistic this will actually happen this time. Jeff?
Yeah, I was going to say, and also I see we're getting a bunch of questions, so maybe go to those. But what I want to quickly say is I agree with Andy, but I say the reason we're going to weather it this time is the devil of the commercial world is out of the box, and you can't stop it. So now we don't have one way for a nation as great as the United States to get to space. Now no one today knows how many companies are doing launches, and so now I agree.
That's not necessarily a good thing.
Well, it's not, but that's the brutal nature. It's another subject of capitalism.
It is. I think, yeah. I'm not as convinced as most people, but then that's why they call me the cosmic curmudgeon. And so, but I generally support the notion. It is different this time, but let's see what people have to say.
Yeah.
I have to take a question. So questions are also being posted in other media. So it's a summarized question by the team. What is the craft near the Atlas? What is that craft near the Atlas model in Andy's background?
Oh, it's not the Atlas. That's the Saturn V.
Yeah.
Oh, you mean what are these things?
Next to Atlas.
Oh,
But
next
it's
to
not
the Saturn
Atlas,
V. Oh, flying
so-
saucers. This is kind of a tribute to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And so you've got the white mouse, the rats, which are the most intelligent species in the universe.
That's clear.
You have right here is a Vogon. That's prosthetic Vogon jelts. And then, of course, up on top is the robot in the Hitchhiker's Guide, Don't Panic. Yeah.
So basically you are missing a towel and the 42.
No, the towel was there.
Okay.
The
Okay.
towel was
So
there. And yes, you're right. I need to right up here. Right up there. One of these days I'll do it. But 6 times 9 equals 42, which is, of course, the most important equation in the universe.
and the answer to all questions.
Well, yeah, that's what I mean. But it's, yeah, actually, I found it. There's a paper I need to write, maybe a small book on just how profound the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is, as philosophy. But I did run into somebody who spent some time with Douglas Adams, and he said, "So what's 6 times 9 equals 42? Why are you doing this in a base 13?" This guy was an engineer, so he immediately jumped to that conclusion. And Douglas Adams said, "I don't tell jokes in base 13," which it was beautiful because it means, I look at this stuff in the Hitchhiker's Guide, and I think there's such profound things going on in it. And Douglas Adams was just making jokes. But that's art.
Absolutely. That's fascinating. Thank you for sharing this. Again, it's a day full of discoveries. Now, a bit more serious question from Dr. Egbert Edelbrook, who is also Asgardian member of parliament, and he is also the head of Spaceborne Consortium, who is working with an international team on reproduction in space and is also working with Asgardia on this. As we discussed, Asgardia's mission is to achieve birth of the first human child in space, and therefore embryology is one of the core issues. Dr. Aldrin, NASA and ESA explained that it is difficult for space agencies to address ethically complex challenges like reproduction in space. Do you think Russia is better positioned to address this? Or do you agree with NASA it should be addressed by other entities, for example, Asgardia or biotech companies?
So what I can say is that, yeah, NASA and ESA, in general, I mean, in general, I don't want to cast aspersions on engineers because I'm not one. Those kinds of things are challenging. And so we actually hosted a workshop several years ago on long-term habitation of Mars, and it was focusing on psychological and sociological issues. And one of the questions that came up is, what do you do with a Martian baby? And then the answer was, well, that can't happen. We can't allow that because really, as you pointed out, if you have a baby in a very different environment, how do you bring them back to Earth, which is why you need to have artificial gravity. And the engineers just said, no, that's just not going to happen. And the psychologist said, no, it's going to happen. That will happen with people in a confined environment. Unless all you do is send men or just women, you are going to end up with babies. And they said, you have to face that reality. So what I will say in the first part of it is actually, I think that Russia is better equipped because I think Russia has done more research on the psychology of space than the US. I mean, we tiptoe around that because astronauts don't want to talk about psychology. They just don't. And Russia has done a lot of really good research on that at Oleg Gazyanko's institute, the IMBP. I think it's still around. Has done lots of interesting research on that. But even then, it's probably going to be too hard for governments. So Asgardia it probably needs to happen outside of governments. So you win.
We as Asgardia win because also we actually are in collaboration with IBMP in their Sirius project.
Good.
We already had an Asgardian resident, Dr. Victoria Kirichenko, who participated in the previous crew mission of 8 months. And we're right now, together with IBMP, selecting a new Asgardian resident. We have about 10 valid applications. The selection will be done later in the summer for the isolation to start in November for 1 year. So that's
I'm very happy to hear that IBMP is still around. I know it's been tough to be running a scientific research institute in Russia for the last couple of decades. So that's great to hear.
They are doing extremely well, and we are delighted to cooperate with them and participate in the experiments. About lack of love to psychologists, I can say from personal experience that for me, it's very incestuous that the same psychologist is doing research, is doing report, and is doing crew support. For me, these are three people who should not only not be the same, they should not even talk to each other. It's like having a secrecy with your doctor, with your lawyer. Your psychologist who is there to support you should be totally a person who is forbidden from disclosing what you discuss with him. And the way, as far as I know, and at some point I knew it quite closely, the way the psychology worked, the support worked, the same person who is advising a crew member on whatever can be psychological questions of his well-being is the same person who is advising the medical department on how to deal with the crew. For me, this is totally wrong. So from at least what I observed, they distrust them for a good reason. But again, things may be moved on. I just realized, actually, Jeff, I asked you about the source of Countdown, but I just realized that my own book about space was called My Countdown. I never thought what was Countdown about until you spoke about it. But actually, I wrote a book in 2009, 2010 about flight to the International Space Station with a little bit of modern history. But here we go. A question. Where does the famous phrase, Houston, we have a problem, come from? When was it first used? I think it was invented for the movie Apollo 11, but I might be wrong.
Apollo 13.
Apollo 13, yes.
You want to take it?
I don't know.
That was Apollo 13. They called down and said, Houston, we have a problem. It's real. It's in the transcripts, and That's where it comes from. It comes when the oxygen tank exploded on the way to the moon in Apollo 13. They saw the gauges just went crazy. The pressure was dropping, and they called down to the mission control and said, "Houston, we have a problem." So that's where it comes from.
So it really happened. It was not artfully made for the movie.
Correct. Unfortunately, yeah.
Unfortunately. So Navid, another member of Asgardian Parliament who is here with us. He's the chair of Information and Communications Committee. So Navid, glad to see you here. This was a real problem and the crew called to the ground, and then it became more famous after it was used in the movie about those historical events. Several Atlas rockets look us by space. The last one called Y4 Pass, weight 12. Okay, it was amazing, basically. It was something good and it was amazing, and we're delighted about that. Do you expect that in the Artemis, before it flies, there might be some changes in the design to make it better for living conditions? Jeff, maybe you take that. You're closer to the engineering aspect.
I bet Andy has some thoughts, and then we can close out on this. Artemis is wonderful. It's a wonderful international venture to talk about humanity going to the moon, this time to stay. But you know, here goes my platform. It's government designed, developed, and government programs often look like they've been designed by a committee. And indeed, this has been designed by a committee. And so I imagine that there will be changes. By the way, yesterday, as we're taping this, I went to reception at the Canadian Embassy, and there was the Artemis crew with 1 Canadian, 3 Americans. The excitement is real. It's wonderful. However, I believe personally there will be changes as we move along, whether forced by budget realities or forced by or encouraged by innovation in the commercial sector. So we have a long way to go, and we'll see.
I agree. It's just for whatever reasons, I agree with Jeff that it was designed by committee that was largely a political committee, and it's not a very efficient way of doing things, and it is very expensive, and we'll do things differently over time. And I think that we're all going to be surprised for a lot of reasons, some of which are more sort of geopolitical and strategic. We're probably going to get to the moon. The first trips may not happen as quickly as we like, but I think there will be a little bit of a gold rush to the moon for lots of reasons. And I think this will create opportunity. It won't necessarily be initially motivated purely by commerce. There'll be strategic things going on, but it will create commercial opportunities that really could change the course of humanity in a lot of ways.
Jeff, after this book about history of space, will you continue with novels about future?
I don't think so. I was toying with one novel, but you know, I've decided that it is more important to educate. I hate to sound this way, pompous maybe, but I think that the initial reaction to the book has been good. If I can get folks like Andy and others, and I'm not putting you on the spot here, Andy, but to include the book in their curriculum, I think it's important enough to keep going. So I got a day job. Okay. And so, and Voyager is very kind to let me, do these sort of things during the business hours. And so I think it's enough, and I'll keep going with additional episodes.
Yeah, I'm absolutely thinking about avenues for bringing this in. I'm teaching at the graduate level, and it's probably not exactly right for that, but we're doing a lot of work through high school that I think it's a perfect fit for them. And we need to sit down and figure out ways to bring what you're doing into what we're doing at the foundation, because we're out there. I think we're in more than 500 schools at this point. We're looking for things to bring into the classroom.
And that's why I'm going to keep writing.
There will be, of course, a book review in Asgardia Space Journal Room, which also will be broadly distributed at IAC in Baku later this year. There are some questions still in the chat which are very technical. We will not take them because we're running out of time, and we are not engineers here. Those will be addressed more specifically in the webinar with the Minister of Science.
And send questions to me. Let me see. Oh, behavior matter. Okay, I don't know that. No, those are two
They're very technical. We'll deal with them when we have a next science webinar. So that's an amazing webinar. Thank you so much. We're right on time because we have very important people who have very tight schedules. I take from this stunning knowledge where countdown comes from, and that I remind all of you that Donatello, Raffaello, and Leonardo are Italian artists and not only Ninja Turtles, but most importantly, the Aldrin Foundation is there to educate people about space. Jeff Manber is there to bring his lifetime of experience of space research and space promotion and building up of modern space history to all of you through his books, and please read more about it. We will be writing a news item about the webinar where there will be all the links where you can buy the book. Asgardia was founded by Dr. Shurbeli, and it brings together as the first space nation all humans who care about space and peace on Earth and procreation of humanity in the universe. I am Lena De Winne, Prime Minister of Asgardia. Join us in the next webinar, which will be announced, and apply for Parliament if you are a resident. It's your last chance in the next 5 years. Thank you for being with us, and goodbye.